Hello, sveiki visi. Aš čia atsistojau, nes kad matytų žmonės, kurie žiūri online. Tai viskas bus angliškai, tai dabar aš į anglų kalbą ir persijungiu. Welcome everyone participating here in person and also joining us online. It's great to have you here. And it's really great to have my colleagues from EFPA eHealth group who are going to be presenting today, and we'll have 2 hours for presentations and also questions about psychology and technology in broader terms. And I'd like to invite Tom, who is a group leader, to introduce this seminar and tell you a little bit more what's on the plans for EFPA eHealth group.
All right. This mic, that mic, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining here today, or online or in person. Let me first and foremost tell you a little bit more about the EFPA project group. And for those of you attending online, ideally, I would ask you to mute your microphone. Otherwise, we might be listening in on you. So let's see if this works. We have this joke in technology. On average, technology fails us from time to time, but fortunately, we got things running. So let me tell you a little bit more first and foremost about EFPA, because that might not be a familiar organization to some of you. It's the European Federation of Psychologists Associations. So it's a European overarching structure of psychology associations. And what we aim to do within that organization is to tackle joint challenges that we see across different nations. And the use of technology within psychology and mental health care also as a whole is one domain that has many common challenges and also opportunities that we from time to time like to focus and address in this particular project group. We're here now together with Jonas as our local host. We're here now with the 4 of us, but there's actually quite a number of us spread out across the continent. Basically, we have a substantial number of different members, all with their own expertise in this very diverse domain. And what we tend to do is we tend to collaborate and to offer psychologists across Europe some resources that may help and support them in better making use of technology. Like, for example, guidelines on online consultations, suggestions on ethical use of technology, but also some training and additional information on upcoming technologies and how you can implement them in clinical practice or research, for example. And you can find that and more on the EFPA website, which is ehealth.efpa.eu. This webinar today is actually, and this meeting today is the first of a series that we're aiming to do over the course of 2023, where we will be tackling in not 2-hour, but 1-hour sessions, specific domains and challenges one at a time. So I don't know it by heart. So I'm going to slightly twist the monitor. So we have Maria Karekla, for example, from Cyprus, focusing on wearables. Jonas himself will share his expertise on online interventions. Per Kalbring from Sweden will look at some of the potential negative effects of the online interventions that Jonas will tell nothing but good about, I assume. I have some more to tell about immersive technologies than I'll be telling you today. David, who's here today, together with from Slovenia, together with Andreas from Austria, will dive into ecological momentary assessment and just-in-time interventions. Lisa Hadouk from France, together with João from Portugal, will focus on online teleconsultations. Freddie Lange from Germany and also the Board of Ethics of EFPA will focus on ethical practice. And Niels Peter Rigaert, who's a member of the Board of Promotion and Prevention at EFPA and also, I think, a Danish national, if I'm correct, will focus on e-learning and how it can be used for preventative interventions. So that's just a first sneak preview of what's to come in 2023. So there'll be freely accessible webinars that will probably also be recorded and disseminated afterwards. But we're still in the midst of constructing the program, and we welcome any questions, suggestions, and potential additions. So if there's one particular topic or question that's really burning and you really want an answer to it, don't hesitate. You can always go to bit.ly/EFPA 2023 or use a QR code with your smartphone to go to a little form where you can submit any suggestions or ideas that you might want to see addressed in these future webinars. So that's for what's to come in the relatively near future. But what's next for today? Well, today we call this a little bit of a sneak preview, as we're going to be talking about four related yet slightly different things regarding technology and well, the use in clinical practice. And we're really going to try to make it a bit practice oriented, giving specific tips, tricks, suggestions on what you can or cannot do and what you can or cannot expect from these type of technologies. So we aim for roughly, we're going to try to do some strict timekeeping, 20 to 25-minute talks where we have room, hopefully, for like 1-2 questions each. I think we have to leave this room by 5 p.m. for sure. So I'm gonna have to be very strict, but you can always ask us afterwards if time might be running out or so. For the people here attending, you can just raise your hands. And for the people attending online, you can just type your questions in the chat. And again, time permitting, we'll try to address them at the end of each talk as adequately as possible. Without further ado, or with a little bit more ado, perhaps, and I'm going to take, apologies for that, João, but I don't want to say anything wrong. I'm going to take my laptop with me. João Salgado is an associate professor at ISMAI, the University of Maya. And apparently I have an old bio here, but I assume it's still relevant. His main research is in empirical research focusing on psychotherapy, depression, and the potential for online interventions. And today he'll be talking a bit more about online consultations in particular, and give you some concrete suggestions and tips and insights based on fairly recent research in this domain. So without further ado now, I happily give you the floor, João.
Thank you. While you are doing that, I just take the opportunity to thank everybody. First, to thank Jonas and the University of Vilnius for welcoming us, and for this precious day that we are having, and for the opportunity that EFPA and my national association, Ordem dos Psicólogos, is giving me to be part of this group. It has been a privilege to be part of this group. So I will be talking about teleconsultations in clinical psychology. And actually, for example, there is an APA series, an APA webinar about this, and it's like 8 hours of duration. So I think it will be impossible to synthesize in 20 minutes what we can talk about this. It seems a very obvious topic, but it's not that obvious. But I will try to be as practical as possible. So I will leave the scientist and the theoretician that I have in myself behind, and I will just focus on much more on practical aspects. So let's give a brief introduction. When I'm referring, the term teleconsultation can be have multiple meanings. So over here, I'm referring to teleconsultations as remote consultations. So consultations that take place at a distance. And so the client and professional are located in different places. So you may have digital tools like video conference, VoIP, email, chat, virtual worlds. All of them may enable some form of contact. But over here, I will be much more focused on video conferencing. Because nowadays video conference is widely used, and most of the people, most of the psychologists that are using any kind of forms of contact are privileging video conferencing. Does that mean, for example, that phone calls are outdated or they are not to be applicable? It's not the case. I will refer briefly that some cases the phone is your best friend. So sometimes you still need the phone for several situations. So I will focus over here, and let's just go back a little bit in time. Let's just go back to the beginning of the pandemic. And Tom, we came to know that it was his wife that gave the idea. So we have to thank your wife for having the idea of, in the beginning of the pandemic, to conduct a survey. Initially, it was meant for only to be focused on Europe, but actually we had several other countries also participating. But the idea was to make a point of the situation about consultations, online consultations, and the practice and previous training that people had. And so we were able to reach 8,000 or something like that. But for this initial study, we just, because different countries had different rates of participation, and otherwise we would be swallowed by the Italian that were very, very adherent to this survey. So we restricted this to 250 participants for each country when we reach that maximum, and we have more than 2,000 individuals participating here. So the main results were that I will be just briefly pointing this. There is a paper about this, but the previous experience of online consultations was approximately 1/3 of the psychologists. So only 1/3 of psychologists had some experience of online consultations before the pandemic. But then 60% of the psychologists between March 20 and the 5th of May, in 1 month and 1/2, in a very brief period, 60% already had provided online consultations, and 80% were intending to do so. So it was a huge increase and quick increase of until 80%. Okay, so and when we asked about the training, only almost a little more than 11%, almost 10% of the people had some training, and some of the trainings were really, really short, less than 4 hours. So there is a huge gap between the need and the previous preparation that people had. Okay. The main concerns that people had were of varied nature, but there was a performance expectancy. Lots of psychologists, some of the ones using the technology, already using the technology and the video conferencing for doing online consultations, were experiencing some anxiety about things like relational aspects. Is it possible to have, and it's obvious, if you don't have experience, this kind of issues must come to your consciousness. So is it possible to have a good alliance with the clients doing video conferencing? Or is it possible to pinpoint the non-verbal aspects of our interaction and emotions? And can I be able to perform all this new stuff? Because there's new things and cables and wireless and software that I really, I'm not a technician. I'm not an IT engineer or technician. And then there is also some, I would suspect that nowadays these issues would be raised, these things that have to do with contextual factors, that have to do with technical difficulties, and also with privacy. Okay. I would believe that, I think that one of the major challenges that we have as psychologists doing online consultations is to guarantee that on the other, you have control on your setting, but you don't have control on what happens in the other side of the conference, so you don't have control. You cannot, if you are doing in-person sessions, you can place the chairs and the window and the light and the paintings, whatever, the way you want. When you get inside other people's house, you don't necessarily know what will happen there. And privacy is a problem. I think that we had during the pandemic, we had some surprises about this. And then there are also other factors, but these were the main things. So in sum, at May 2020, we had high uptake of online consultations, limited previous training, and varied concerns about the performance relation aspects, privacy, technical difficulties, ethical issues, and then some practical aspects like payments, reimbursements, price of the platforms, practical issues, right? What do we know about online consultations then and now? Is that some things are different, but one thing we know, it works. So it may not work for everybody. It may not work for every condition. It may not work in the same way that it works as in person. There are some differences. Yes, there are differences that need to be accounted, but it works. So actually, the clinical trials we have show that it works. Actually, you need to be a little bit cautious about the clinical trials in this field, because actually they are usually controlling the other side of the line. They are having some control about the conditions in which you are offering. Usually, for example, some of the trials are not, the clients are not in their home. They may be in a specific office for this clinical trial. And this makes a difference. So you can be 300 kilometers, 3,000 miles away. It does not matter. It's a specific spot, a specific location in which have good conditions of privacy, you have good lines, you have good communication, everything is set, okay? But it may not happen that way in, I would say, daily life. But the same thing applies actually in clinical trials in general. So the clinical trials we do in our labs, it's not really the same thing as doing routine practice. You know that. So what would be the key competence for an adequate practice? And I would invite every student to prepare themselves in this way, but also every professional that was launched without proper training to think, am I trained about this? So the main competencies are all the skills that are mandatory for a clinical practice, usually, but also you need to adapt to the specific media that you are using, okay? So, so what are the main domains of competence? And over here, I'm stealing and somehow changing a little bit this framework from the Daele behavioral competencies that STEEPS, it's an American organization. So I would highlight intake assessment procedures and delivery of treatment. Competencies that have to do with the virtual environment, the telepresence and the therapeutic presence. These are in red, the ones that I would have much more time dedicated here. Then you have to have some information about and some training about technological choices, legal and regulatory issues, collection of digital information, and also ethical issues. So about intake assessment procedures and delivery treatment, I will just pinpoint some of these things. What should we do? I will not, as I told you, there is an APA workshop of 8 hours about this. So I'll be very, very brief, but I will just highlight some of the things that make more sense to me. review with the client carefully. When you are receiving a new patient, a new client, review carefully beforehand the appropriateness, if it's appropriate to do teleconsultations. Clients may not be familiar with video conference. Clients may not be willing to do that. They may be uncomfortable with that. So you can check if it's a possibility for them, if they are comfortable with that, and what other choices. If not, what other choices do you have? Then you have to adapt. This goes without saying, but sometimes people forget this. We need to adapt all the procedures that we usually have in person and all the requirements to the teleconsultation. For example, if you are, let's say, doing some intellectual achievements tests or something like that, you need some solids. You need to have some figures to manage. Well, you can do that by a distance, but you need to think about, what will I need? Do I need someone to assist me in the other end? Do I need a professional tele assistant? It's possible in some cases. Or you need to think ahead about these things. Then you need to monitor the real engagement with teleconsultations. So it's not only a matter of the person accepted. You need to check if the people not only accepting it initially, but is really adhering to this. The initial screening, well, ideally, if it's possible to have an initial in-person session, do it whenever it's possible. Okay. Is that always possible? No. And during the pandemic, it wasn't possible in most of the circumstances. Did it work well? Most of the times. But is it the way you do the initial screening should also include the initial an assessment of the initial preferences and needs of the client, also in terms of attending the consultations, about the medium that you are using. And if they are, for example, are not really comfortable with video conferencing, you may need to choose, for example, telephone and doing some sessions by phone. And in terms of, I will talk briefly about plans for risky situations. And it's always a good idea to have a phone number from your client if you need to get in touch with him or her in some crisis situation, for example. Or, for example, if the line goes off, if you just don't have any way of contacting the client through the internet, for example. So, and then you have to also systematically review any potential obstacles to teleconsultations. Is the wireless connection good enough, or do you need cable? Is the person able to have a connection by cable, or is the lights work well? There's always, and there are lists that you can use for these kind of things. By accepting a new client, you decide that the technology is appropriate for this client, that the available physical settings are also adequate, and when possible, verify the contact, because you may need to reach the client for several reasons, and you need to have this, when possible, to verify the contact. There is some dispute and some discussion about, is it possible to be anonymous? Well, not in some circumstances. The general rule is don't do that. It may be tricky. It may create some difficult situations to manage, because you don't know what's behind that anonymous thing. Why the person is that I never had an in-person client asking me to be anonymous. I don't want you to know my name. It's very strange. And I think that most of the cases, I think that people may have some fantasies and some issues about this, but usually it's not a good idea to have an anonymous client. avoid contacts through email. You need the email sometimes, but usually email is not considered a safe and secure way of communication. You have always, as a matter of care, to develop an emergency plan just for anything that may go wrong. You can have psychological emergencies, but you can also have, I would say, health problems. Imagine that you are doing a consultation and the other person is in another place in the world, and the person starts to have a heart attack. If you are in your own country, you dial, you can dial and say, come here, and this person is in that place. But if you have another place in the world, you should have some contact about the health information and have this at your hands, and explain and sign an informed consent form. There are lots of places in the internet where you can have models about this. Exclusions when possible. Should we exclude some clients? If possible, yes. It's not really advisable usually to admit this kind of clients with symptoms like psychotic symptoms, severe depression and anxiety problems, severe substance dependence, or impulsive clients, or risk of, in which, for example, you can have risk of violence, for example. Does that mean that I have to exclude them? No, but you need to be aware that these are clients that should be referred to in-person treatment. And you only should accept these clients if any kind of in-person treatment is not available. If the person is isolated in the middle of Australia, like it happens, and there is no way of getting any kind of treatment, well, that's the available choice, but that's an exception. Assessment and treatment procedures. You should be as thorough as you are usually as in an in-person consultation. So you need to adapt all the materials, all the situations beforehand, and you can be, as I told you before, potentially aided by teleassistants. This teleassistant can be a paraprofessional, someone that prepares the person in a remote location. For example, you can have, this happens in some places, that you can have someone that has a specific room in which people can use. It's a community room for psychological consultations at distance, and they go there and the online thing is all prepared, and there is one person that is in charge of doing all the remote stuff, okay? And then the person is there. By the end, the person just the teleassistant logs off and deals with the payments or whatever administrative procedures are at stake. But you can also have people that are there. That can be a family member, for example. If you are working with children, it can be the parents or a sister or brother or someone else, okay? So I've already told about the safety plans. And then we have also another issue that needs to be addressed. That has to do with virtual environments, telepresence, and therapeutic presence. So by telepresence, we refer to as this feeling of being there, not being there, as if, okay? So we can, I like this expression from Liz Aduk, she's part of our team. She calls this remote presence. And we always experience a little bit like that when we are at cinemas, I would say, but we also have that experience by the phone, by video conference, and of course by virtual reality or augmented reality. And this has proven to be a key element for good results. For example, Bouchard and clients have a study in which they associate the development of therapeutic alliance as something that moderates the fact that therapeutic alliance has on outcome. Well, what we are talking about here, what is wrong here in terms of telepresence? Okay, the backlight effect, okay? This is wrong, right? But what is wrong here? It's not the therapist, by the way. We have a distracting and messy background, a strange light defect above the head. And those guys that are balding like I am need to be aware of this. Sometimes we are shining, too shiny. What is wrong here? Looking from above. Over here, I'm just holding my laptop to take a picture. And usually, if you are using like this, the person would see you as if you are looking from above, which is not the place you want to be the therapist. You don't need to feel down. What is wrong here? Well, the background is okay. 1/3 of the screen is okay. Looking to the camera as if the face, there's no shades on the face, but there is some reflex on the glasses. And for us using glasses, this is a challenge. And over here, we could manage. But for example, some days ago, I was having a session with a person in another place in the world, and she had a strong reflex on her eyes, and I could not see her eyes at all, okay? So the only solution was to take off the glasses. I hope she had seen me a little bit, but and about clothes, avoid strange things, not strange things, things that look strange in the camera. There are lots of places where you can consult about stripes and things like that. Some tips for good telepresence, okay? Adopt an adequate posture. Avoid too much gestures like I'm doing now. Lean slightly forward. It's a good idea, not too much, but a little bit. Be a little more expressive than you would be in a regular context. A little more. Some people say 10%. I don't know what's 10%, but a little more. Make eye contact. You just need to place the camera a little bit above and talk to the person. And that way you would make eye contact. There is a good article about that. And if you are working on a laptop, just put something, a book or something below in order to make it higher. The light, avoid shades, good lighting from multiple angles, avoid distracting backgrounds, clothes with distracting patterns, test reflex in glasses, and the sound, use appropriate devices. Usually, I never use Bluetooth devices because they are dangerous in terms of security. And they also can have some problems in terms of batteries. You can turn off, check for privacy, and test everything beforehand. Test with a friend or colleague or something, okay? Some informed technological choices. You should remember that the psychologist is responsible for the technology choices, but not entirely for their operation. So if there's something goes wrong with this specific software, okay, bad advertising or false advertising, okay, that's their problem, but you are responsible for example, you cannot say that, oh, I'm using WhatsApp video. No. Everybody knows that WhatsApp video is not secure. So and you are responsible for that. You can use it, but only for exceptional situations in which there is no other way of reaching the client. Up to end encryption, follow the general data protection regulations, check your signed agreements with software providers, and look for the words like privacy or security or safety. And usually you, in the middle of all those pages, you have to check if everything is the way you want. A simple rule, and even if it's potentially fallible, is if it's cheap, it probably is not safe enough in terms of security and data protection. Mention the potential risks in the informed consent by the client. And some notes on legal and regulatory issues and ethical issues. So we have national and transnational regulations of professional practice of teleconference. This change from one place to the other, but you have to look for the European context and your national context. You have to check also latest regulation, international provision of services. For example, It's mandatory. You can, for example, in the European community, you can see someone from abroad, and you are able to, the law that is regulating your practice is your own country law, but it's preferable to state that in the agreement, in the consent form with the client beforehand. And you need to master the national and transnational ethical codes. Thank you for your time. I hope this was practical enough. Thank you. Sure. And
don't go just yet. We have time for one quick question. I don't know if anybody in particular has a question at this point. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for this interesting presentation. Actually, myself and my colleagues were also studying online therapy just, I think, 1 year into the pandemic, and we found many interesting things, such as, how we are focusing on transference and things like that. And in a face-to-face therapeutic session, we are listening to the patient and they're describing their parents or relationships with their partners. And in online therapy, sometimes you see them walking in the background. Yeah. So that seems to be one of the most pertinent issues that you mentioned. But the therapists we interviewed, they were mostly from Gestalt, psychodynamic, kind of humanistic therapeutic paradigms. And I wondered whether you noticed, or maybe there's some research that you and your colleagues are doing that describe the kind of differences between the different therapeutic paradigms and maybe how effective they are, what differences there are within the online model of each therapeutic paradigm.
Actually, it's very interesting. I know pieces of research done in different schools of therapy. Most of them are CBT oriented, but I don't recall any study comparing different kinds of schools. Actually, I would say that the most common problems that we have in online sessions are transversal for everybody. So, for example, in that respect, if you are doing an online session and you are seeing people behind, this to me is a sign that or the client is being intruded and someone is not following the rules that were previously agreed with. But this is a clear sign that probably you don't have enough conditions to do the therapy itself, and it's affecting necessarily. So actually, you need to be, for example, if we are doing empty chair work in emotion-focused therapy with a parent and the parent is in behind, no, it's not a good idea to have that. You are just putting a fire in that place, and you need to be aware. So something like this can happen. It's much more easier. It's easier to happen in online sessions. It's much more difficult to control because it's not only a matter of shutting down the door or shutting the door. And of course, life can get in between in several ways. So it's a much more risky situation. So this needs to be discussed previously. And even though, even if we discussed that previously, we need to deal as a kind of a rupture, not necessarily from the client, but an alliance rupture from the environments. So they are not giving proper conditions. So we need to deal with this with the client and to discuss this and to find proper conditions to have sessions. Okay.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Up next is you sit tight, David. I think you're third in line. Object is in Jonas. Put your slides on. He's playing a home match postdoctoral fellow here at Vilnius University primarily focusing on research on the effectiveness of internet-delivered interventions, with a particular focus on depression, anxiety, and stress-related disorders. And he's also, as you should know by now, the Lithuanian representative or the Lithuanian representative in the project group on eHealth. And today we'll be talking about internet-based interventions yet again, but with some current trends in both research and practice. So you have the floor, Jonas. Thank you. Thank you.
Right. Right. So I will be talking quite a bit about different things than João did, but they are on a continuum. So first off, what is internet-based interventions, telehealth, telepsychology? Is it the same, or is it? Do we have distinct interventions, so to speak, using online tools? So there was a consensus paper that came out from experts in the field of psychology and technology that debated this issue. And well, I'll give you a sneak peek of the paper they published. And as you see, there's a lot of different terms to define work, psychological work online. Most popular ones were like digital health or teletherapy or telepsychiatry. And I'm not adding to clarification here with my topic, which is internet-based interventions, and it's not even here. So, you know, update the review, right? So probably should have called this internet-delivered interventions. So keep that in mind. Yeah. But so as you see, there's no consensus on. Their consensus was that there's no consensus. So there's no consensus on what terms to use where. There are slight differences in modalities. So that's why I like this classification from Professor Munoz and colleagues. It's called digital apothecaries. So if you would look at this as a continuum, that would be better. It's now divided into 4 types, but if you look at it as a continuum, it would be better. So type 1 would be just traditional face-to-face therapy that we do in person in our private practice or in clinics. And then the problem with that is it's consumable, meaning that one client can have one psychotherapist or one psychologist at a time, and it's very time consuming. It has to have, you have to have a lot of resources, human resources to provide all the necessary treatments. Then we have type 2 therapies, which are face-to-face, same face-to-face therapies, but augmented with some technology. Like you can switch to teletherapy, or you can have online questionnaires or in-person questionnaires, but that gets filled in during the session and that automatically scored, you know, so just to save time, or you do this before the therapy, like put in an iPad or whatnot, how you feel, and you know your therapist now knows how your week went, or so that would be type 2, what they would call type 2 intervention or therapy, and it's also very consumable in a sense that you need the therapist present all the time there. Moving to the right, I'll be talking about this. Yeah. Actually, this was what João was talking about, and there are studies showing that it can be effective for various situations, but also transdiagnostically, so to speak. But I'm going to be talking about this type of interventions. These are guided interventions, and they have even more support in terms of research evidence. They've been studied quite extensively for the past 20 years, and they're still consumable. Like you do have guidance in the intervention, and so there has to be a psychologist, not necessarily though. In some cases, a trained support worker can do just fine with. You don't have to have like a PhD in psychology to provide this kind of support in some of the interventions, but it's still consumable, but it requires less engagement from the therapist. So we did some studies. I'll tell you a little more about it later, but we did some studies here at Vilnius University. So these are usually not synchronous contact. So like you get a message from your patient or your client, or in our case, our participants. And then at the end of the day, you get like 15 messages. You sit down and you take 2 hours or so to respond to all of them. And that's it. And you just had contact with 15 patients. So it's still consumable, but it's less consumable. And then you need less human resources. And there are studies showing that these type of interventions can not only be effective, but they can be cost effective in terms that they're relatively cheaper than face-to-face therapy. Of course, there are some caveats, and as João mentioned, in telepsychology, teleconferencing, same in here, you wouldn't provide this type of therapy to someone with very severe condition, with very severe conditions, someone who needs perhaps inpatient treatment. So yeah. And we're not going to be talking about the last one, type 4 therapies. So those were self-help books, basically non-consumable, something you cannot consume. Like you read a book, you put it back into the library, someone else goes to the library, picks up a self-help book, reads it, puts back there, hopefully doesn't do an illegal copy, right? But but it's not consumable, so you cannot consume it, and it doesn't require any further. Once it's there, it doesn't require any more effort from the mental health professional. How am I doing with time? I feel like I'm talking. 50 minutes left. Oh, good. Good. Right. So. Mostly these third type 3 interventions that were studied were CBT, but also other treatments have been studied in recent years. Well, in recent years, I did mention that the field is almost 25 years old or something like that. So recent years is very recent years, and yeah, there are there's a systematic review and meta-analysis published 2 years ago that found 7 studies in a randomized controlled trial studying psychodynamic therapy. I did forget to mention that the practical aspect of this presentation is going to be less practical than João's, but you probably already noticed that it's because completely different treatment. How it looks, I'll describe, but it does require more preparation in terms. You're nodding along because you know, right? Okay, so sometimes these interventions can also be in the form of apps. Like you can use an app to communicate with your psychologist and have self-help treatment with psychologist support in an app. But a recent meta-analysis, not that recent, it was in 2017, I think, found that only 2 apps of Apple Store, Google Store, and the Microsoft Store. 2 apps of all the app pool were tested, like in the trials, and only one of them was still available in the app stores, in those stores. So they're really under-tested. Another study that did content analysis found that, the apps were like credible, but the content of them deviated from the recommendations from association, professional associations, what professional associations recommend quite significantly, and the overlap with the recommendations was 18 to 26%. So like 3/4 of the material in the app were not something that professionals in mental health care would recommend. So yeah, so that's something to keep in mind. Right. What kind of conditions were tested? This is a review from Professor Gerhard Andersson, who's you could say one of the beginners, founders of the field, so lots of psychiatric conditions have been tested in clinical trials, but also somatic conditions as well, like diabetes, tinnitus, cancer, and smoking, and other psychological conditions like procrastinations, and also what was that? Perfectionism as well. Yeah, it's here. Perfectionism as well. So not only in clinical psychology, but also broader topics were studied with this type 3 therapies. Right. So they do work, but the question is, do they work as good as face-to-face therapy? Like, okay, we find effects, and we see that patients or clients improve, and they get better in terms of their symptoms and well-being, but how is it compared to face-to-face therapy? Can it be comparable? And there's a 2018, I think, meta-analysis led by our group member from Sweden, Perl Kalbring, that did this meta-analysis and looked whether those could be comparable, and they found that they're roughly equivalent, like face-to-face treatment and internet-based intervention with therapist support yield approximately the same effects. For and these were studies for social anxiety disorder, panic disorder, depressive symptoms, body dissatisfaction, and you can see others here as well. So, but that was a study comparing ICBT versus face-to-face CBT. Other treatments were haven't been studied so much yet. I did mention psychodynamic therapy, but and others like systemic therapy and others, but not so much. Okay, but I've been talking about internet-based interventions, but what are they actually? So they're usually very similar to self-help interventions, something you would get like in previously in a workbook or like a site, and this is an example from a study we did. We just finished actually on depression for older adults using a Swedish platform, and you can see here modules. It's very, very simple. Although it looks simple, it was too difficult for some of the participants to navigate even, because they were older adults, above 60. So we have to consider these kind of details while developing internet-based interventions, like who's going to use them, and will they be able to get around there and understand, like there were anecdotal situations, and we had assessments after the intervention. We would call our participants and say, hello, we did send you a questionnaire, and we did send you a reminder. Would you be so kind and answer the questions we sent you in the email? And they were like older adults. That was during the summertime. They were like, oh, you did? That's wonderful. I haven't been to my computer for 3 weeks because I'm in my countryside, but I really liked your program. I'll definitely come back and and fill in the questionnaires. So people use their devices rather differently than what we would expect from like this generation, from younger people who are always in the phone, always checking things. So not everyone is doing the same. So that's just to add on that we need to consider who's going to be using it and how they are going to be using it. So the most the best example I like was from a previous study we did for adjustment disorder a while ago, and one of our most active participants was the oldest participant, and she would register her exercises, which are like 10 to 15 minutes. You have to do them for 10 to 15 minutes, and there were 10 of them, and she would register them in 1 minute intervals, like check, and then we get a log of 1 minute later, check, and then 1 minute. And we were like contacting her and saying, you know what, if you decide not to do the exercise, could you please just push the back button and not the save button? Because that gives us the wrong impression that you're doing the exercises. So we just texted her like, a message on the platform. And she was furious. She was furious. She was like, not how dare you, but what do you think of me? I printed out the exercises. I have a quiet room in my house where I go there, I do all the exercises, I indicate how I feel after each and every one of them, and then I come back to the computer and I input all the details. And we were like, oh, that's also an option. Like, people can use internet-based interventions this way as well. So yeah, we were quite surprised, but that just goes, these anecdotal situations, but they just go to show you how differently people can use online, not only interventions, but in general technologies, right? Yeah, so again, as I mentioned, very heavily text-based, wonderful, text-based, and we have modules here. We would ask them to reflect on their week, on what they did, what the exercises they performed, and ask them to summarize, for example, the material. How did you understand this concept? Could you, in your own words, describe how do you understand this, and also share what you take out of this week, or how are you take out. That would be, in Lithuanian, sounds very, very good, take out. Yeah, but and we do have an option to reply to them. So we would see that they register their exercise, they submit their comment, and we would then, within 24 hours, ideally, reply to them. So usually like just encouraging them to keep using the program, because they would do the exercises quite all right, and would understand the concept and what's been told, like in the program for that week. So it would usually be just like, you're doing a great job. I see you've reflected, and we would also maybe reflect their emotions if they had some, and or quickly respond to any concerns or questions they have. But that's usually like 4, 5, 6 sentences max, and then the conversation is over. Like we wouldn't go into therapy there. So that's how we do support. Okay, so I just wanted to show that we do have more studies here that are now in preparation or actually being implemented at the moment or in the past. Most of them are now from the Center for Psychotraumatology. So wait for Augusta. Is anyone else here from? No. We have a representative. Make sure you mention that I mentioned you, right? And then some of them are concluded, but we're trying to have a like broader scope of conditions and not just only focus on something on one condition, right? Okay, good. Round up. Good. Yeah. So attitudes matter, and João didn't mention, but the study we did on telepsychology and the online consultations, attitudes change after trying. So we did see that our participants there indicated that when I tried, it's not that scary, it's not that as difficult, and it's actually I feel that I can connect with my patient. Same here. Same applies to internet-based interventions. It's like you can understand if you connect, if there's some resistance from the participant, or if it's engaged or not. Also, negative effects, just wanted to mention, there's now a movement to report negative effects and not to just put them in the drawer. So apparently, a large patient-level meta-analysis showed that negative effects are smaller in intervention groups compared to control groups. And very quick word on implementation. So you did quite well to prepare a website with all the materials and have support. It's rather extensive work, and the single psychologist wouldn't do this, right? This has to be a system, some kind of a system where you provide services to a bigger population. So of course, in Australia, where there are distances and people cannot travel that easy, and in USA also, they were the pioneers that started doing implementing into their mental health services. So that's an example from UK and also from Australia. And the quick word, like how does the research translate into effectiveness in real life? So there are now studies that show that actually you can retain the same effects when you implement the interventions in clinical settings, regular clinical practice, and retain the effects. But yeah, more studies need to be done. Most of them, as I mentioned, are Sweden, Netherlands, Australia, and that's it. So at least in this study, so it's not widely implemented. In Lithuania, we don't have services available in our mental health care like regular services, right? And I think I can skip this and just say thank you. Yeah. One question.
So one quick question, Jonas. So people listening to this at the moment, they might think, well, great internet-based interventions, but why not, if they are still consumable, they still take time and effort, why not just go all the way up till type 4? Why not just leave out the psychologist? Is there any particular reason why we're not doing that just altogether?
Yes, wonderful question. There is a reason. And the first study is to try and do that, where actually from Australia, and there was a program called MooGym, and they had a dropout rate of around 93%, I think, not from 93, 97%, something like that. So huge numbers of participants would start the intervention, and then they would drop out. They would drop out because it's actually other studies shown that if it's easy come, it's easy go. Like if you have to work harder to get into the intervention, then you're more likely to stay in there. So the effect sizes are also a little bit smaller, but mostly it's engagement, how participants interact with the intervention, and the dropout rates that are significantly higher in standalone interventions compared to therapist-guided interventions. Yeah, thank you. Good question.
All right, so up next, if David Gosar, you can fix your presentation in the meantime. So he's a clinical psychologist working at the Department of Child, Adolescent and Developmental Neurology at the University Children's Hospital in Ljubljana, Slovenia. He has a very extensive bio. So I'm gonna limit myself at this point to saying that he's professionally definitely interested in using, I think that's the one indeed, in using ecological momentary assessment, abbreviated EMA, and he'll tell you a little bit more about how that's being currently used in research, but also how that may translate to practice. So David, you have the stage.
Okay, so thank you again, Jonas, for your hospitality, and it was a wonderful time here in Vilnius. So I'd like to take you along for the ride with ecological momentary assessment in research and clinical practice. And today I'll talk about a few issues that are related. First, I'd like to explain what ecological momentary assessment is for those of you not familiar with the topic. I'll talk about something in terms of statistical methodology. It's an important thing to know if you want to do that type of research or do clinical work to understand where that data and findings come from. I'll also talk about some contemporary research applications of this methodology and the type of new questions it allows us to answer and pose, of course, and some current and future clinical implications. As you'll see, this is a technology that's evolving quickly, but has not really had the widespread adoption you might think, given the hype of what e-mental health can do for the population in general. And finally, I'll turn to some resources, things you can use if you want to do an EMA study, or if you're looking into how that might be useful in clinical practice. I'll give you some pointers as to where to look for that. Okay, so let's get going. Okay. So what is ecological momentary assessment? It all started with this paper on top by Stone and Schiffman in 1994. And the idea was that ecological momentary assessment involves repeated sampling of subjects' current behavior and experiences in real time in a person's natural environment. And that was seen as the real major advantage. So it avoids retrospective bias. We as psychologists know what a big issue that is, both in terms of mood congruent effects, prior beliefs, recent and salient events, and so forth. Also, this type of method was seen as ecologically valid. So it told us something about how someone functions in the real world settings, not just in laboratory settings. It also allowed for something that had thus far been neglected, and that's intense longitudinal data. So getting many time points to understand how a certain process unfolds in time, how several processes unfold in time, and how those processes interact with each other to unfold in behavior. And finally, more recently, this type of methodology allows the integration of several sources of data. So not only self-report, but self-report integrated with different sensor data, with variables and so forth. We'll touch upon that later on. Okay, in terms of disadvantages, there are quite a few. Obviously, we heard before today, there's a lot of issues choosing and maintaining text. So if you want to run a study or have a clinic using that technology, you need to have the technical skills to make sure that the servers are running, that the software is running correctly, and so forth. So that might also mean tech support for the participants and your patients. They need to have someone to call if things aren't working. And you might, as a clinician, might not have the time to do that. So that's an important issue. Privacy and data issues abound. Imagine someone having unrestricted access to all your phones, pictures, and that being sent elsewhere. So this is a huge area where we're, as a professional community, working on that issue. to obtain, first, to have you as the user understand where the data is going, what data is being pushed forward, and how is that data being then held in case of all sorts of emergencies and so forth. So here, it's really important that the user is aware what's happening today, and you as a professional using a certain type of software are aware of what happens with that information. And finally, ecological momentary assessment includes assessment in the here and now, multiple times a day, throughout 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and so forth. It's very intrusive. So having the option to turn it off, to have a delay when responding and so forth can be very important in supporting user engagement. There are also other methods, including gamification for that. But it's important to keep in mind that one of the disadvantages, it can be really intrusive and people need to be motivated to use it. So that's, if you're a researcher, if a clinician, you need to make a case to your participants, to your patients, it's worth doing. Okay, so if you look at the literature, this group of methods, which I term ecological momentary assessments, have different names. One of them is, or are methods involved under this rubric, are experience sampling methods, ambulatory assessment, diary methods, and living labs. And these methods have been around for quite a while. For example, experience sampling methods have been around since the 80s. And people just wrote on a piece of paper what they were experiencing at a certain point in time, but have been gaining greater adoption due to use of digital devices, especially smartphones. Smartphones have meant a real revolution in the use of ecological momentary assessment. Why? Because all of us have them. They're usually with us without us even noticing. They can gather really intimate data, both as to where you are, your pictures, your texts, whatever. They're able to sense. So they can sense if you're moving, if you're sleeping, where you're going. They're computationally really powerful. They're far more powerful than the computers that launched the first people onto the moon, and they're obviously remotely accessible. So we can look at and get to there quickly. They gather exact data. They can sample quite quickly, and that's maybe even an issue. For example, if we have something that's sampling at about 1 hertz, or 1,000 hertz, for example, if we're looking at a wearable, it wants to sample, for example, heart rate very specifically, that can create huge amounts of data. And that's not only a technical problem, it gets to be an ecological problem, because if you're using wireless networks to move all that data, that has an energy cost, and that cost is not negligible. Okay, and of course, one of the great advantages of ecological momentary assessment is also that smartphones have the ability to present stimuli via all sorts of ways. Multimedia abilities of modern smartphones far exceed earlier lab equipment. As we'll see later on, you can even use a mobile phone to simulate a virtual environment. So that's a really powerful tool, and can also be a powerful tool for assessment as we do ecological momentary assessment. Okay, so there were 2 catalysts for this major uptake in the use of ecological momentary assessment. As I've said, the wide adoption of smartphone. This is from the Psychology Smartphone Manifesto by Miller in 2012. I liked it because we're coming up to the date, and he wrote that it would border on scientific malpractice if by 2025, when more than 5 billion people will have smartphones, we are still giving paper and pencil questionnaires to a few hundred local college students. Oh my, I'm panicking. I hope we get this thing going better at my lab in the next few years. And an example of why that is the case is for my own home country, Slovenia. You can see the adoption of mobile internet in my country. So in 10 years, it rose from about 47% to 81%. It will rise to 81 in 2026, as projected by our statistics office. There's a second sort of issue why the uptake was greater. Obviously, the COVID pandemic revealed what great mental health needs exist, not only because of the pandemic, but just generally. And one of the key findings was timely intervention is really important. I like this slide. It's one of the few ones. It comes from a British group that's running a program called Improving Access to Empirically Supported Therapies. They mostly deal with depression and anxiety. And throughout the past 10 years, they've been including ever increasing numbers of people in Britain, especially in England specifically, into psychotherapy. And the interesting thing is they collect data for every session for your therapeutic session and for all the waiting lists and people who are waiting to get access. And the super fascinating thing is that that the picture on the left, the graph you can see, where the effectiveness of therapy sort of starts dropping off at about 1 month after waiting for therapy. So this is a nice indication of how important it is to get the therapy quickly for the therapy to be as effective as it can be. So here is this was an idea to use then was an idea to buttress the argument, yes, e-mental health can be a really important tool in providing quick mental health care. Of course, if, as was pointed out by the earlier speakers, the patients are correctly chosen. We'll see later on that this is far from being the case right now, but maybe a thing of the future. Okay, another issue why ecological momentary assessment is fascinating in psychology right now is that it allows us to look at dynamic concepts in psychology. Now, these have always been part of psychology. So if you look at social learning, defense mechanisms, emotion regulations, all postulate things happening, one thing reacting to another, one sort of psychological construct reacting to an environmental situation and so forth. And also, if you look at classifications such as the DSM-5, variability of affect has also always been an indicator of psychopathology. So dynamic sort of concepts have always been a part of psychology. However, the interesting thing is there is a great need to develop explicit theoretical models of psychological microprocesses, how they interact and unfold in time. See, the interesting thing is with ecological momentary assessment, you have to have an idea as to what you want to sample. So how often does someone have to respond to a prompt? Do they have to do that immediately, every 10 minutes, every hour, 2 times a day? There has to be a theoretical justification for that. And if you want a theoretical justification, you need a theory. However, very few exist. So there, currently, if you're a student of psychology, it's really important to think about developing sort of theoretical concepts that incorporate temporal dynamics of emotional and cognitive processes into the work. So these are the sorts of practical questions we're facing. How often, under what circumstances is the construct in question to be measured? What are the possible contingent variables? And what are the report mechanisms? How will we sort of delineate that change in time? And more recently, with the use of variables and sensors, how does sensor data map onto behavior, symptoms, and diagnosis? And I'd like to point out a paper by Frank et al., the title is below, where they look at how to sort of map sensor data and wearable data when looking at anxiety, and map that onto the research domain criteria of the NIH when looking at temporal dynamics. So these are really important questions that need to be sorted out. Okay, I just want to give you an example of theoretical work in this domain. This is from 2015 by Trull et al. And they sort of define 3 major sort of dynamic concepts of affect, of emotion. One is emotional instability. So this is the extent of variability of emotion in time. They also define it mathematically or statistically, how this can be measured. And it's obviously clear when we talk about emotional instability, you think about borderline personality disorder, anxiety, depression, bulimia, PTSD. All of these disorders have been researched with ecological momentary assessment and found to have great emotional stability, unsurprisingly. Emotional inertia is a concept you might not be as familiar with. So this is how long an emotion sustains itself through time. So a simple example of that would be you're having you wake up in the morning, you spill your coffee, your wife gets or your husband gets upset with you, and you're going to work and the day just started badly and it ends up going badly. You feel terrible, you're irritable, and it's going terribly. Another person experiencing the same morning might be really cheery and, oh, it doesn't matter. Oh, my friend's working at work. We'll talk over lunch. It'll be a lot of fun. I'll have great colleagues we can do some fun stuff with. And that just will bounce off you like it's nothing. So this, the concept in another way, emotional inertia is also interesting in terms of positive emotion. So what research shows is that people who are depressed have a difficulty enjoying the moments of life. So for those of us, we just had a great lunch. Oh, that was a nice lunch. That was wonderful food. That was a great discussion. That was pretty good. I really enjoyed that. And that sort of sticks with you and gives you a real protection in terms of having a positive effect and helps you regulate your emotion. With someone who's depressed, they might have a good experience, but the bad experiences tend to mount up and they don't enjoy the good parts of life as much. So that's an interesting sort of dynamical concept. It can be measured by autocorrelation, an important concept in EMA research. Finally, an interesting concept, at least for my sort of work and research I'm interested in, is emotional differentiation. Now, why am I interested in this concept? I work at a pediatric hospital, and we get a lot of patients, children who come to us with different sort of somatic symptoms, headaches, tummy aches, whatever. But these children have, some of them, very poor perception of their own emotion. So they tend to have difficulties differentiating whether they're angry, they're sad, whether they're just distressed and anxious, whatever what it is. So looking at emotional differentiation allows you to understand how well someone differentiates different emotions. So for someone who has poor emotional differentiation, they will be saying that they're feeling poorly, I feel bad, and they feel bad and feel everything at once. They feel sad, they feel tired, they feel anxious. It's all the same. For someone who has more emotional differentiation, they'll differentiate. They'll say, aha, I feel a bit angry. No, I'm not anxious. No, I'm not really irritable. I'm just angry at that person because he did something. So that's an attempt to sort of look at how people are able to perceive complex emotion. And that's done by looking at the interclass correlation between the ratings of different types of emotion in time. Also has been studied in different sort of disorders. For example, borderline personality disorder has been shown to have poor emotional granularity, similar for major depression and schizophrenia. Okay, so this is sort of the theoretical work that's been going on. Obviously, all these statistical concepts have also undergone some critique. And this in this paper, what they point out, this is from Nature Human Behavior, is that these measures, these concepts have yet to really prove themselves in terms of being predictably powerful in terms of prediction. They looking at different sort of research, the authors come to the conclusion that just mean scores over time and standard deviations do pretty much just as well. That's the sort of critique in their paper. I'll try to convince you otherwise, but it's an open debate regarding that. Okay, so when we talk, there we go. Yeah, that's the paper I've been mentioning. When we talk about ecological momentary assessment, we cannot forget that it's really important to understand the statistics behind it to be able to apply it well. So much of the earlier work was based on time series analysis, which included things like autocorrelation, squared differences in time, and also some calculations based on multi-level models, such as mean squared successive differences and probability of acute change. However, with time, new methods developed, and these included multivariate sort of approaches in which each variable is both a predictor and an outcome. And this led this work was based on a form of research looking at a network perspective on psychopathology. And let me just maybe go on to that to explain what it is. So in terms of classical models of understanding mental disorders, is that we have a certain disposition towards them all, or there's something in the brain that causes it, or there's a gene, and this in turn leads to disorder. However, in network models, disorders are seen as a consequence of interactions among symptoms and forming of feedback loops which maintain stable states. So in terms of sleep, this, for example, is an example of psychotic symptoms in sleep. Someone who has difficulty sleeping, has poor attention, is more likely to be suspicious. This again leads to more delusional ideas and discomfort. In turn, that leads back to poorer sleep. And this cycle tends to sort of continue and then lead to greater disorder. So this is, and ecological momentary assessment provides a method wherein using these autoregression, vector autoregression models, you can attempt to get at this sort of dynamic, at least according to the authors. And there have been really interesting models looking at this. However, there are issues with this sort of approach. Most time series models sort of assume equispaced measurement of static processes. Now, what does that exactly mean? equispaced means that you have to have the measurement of some psychological process at the exact same point every time. That's one thing. And the second, static processes, means that the general level of this process isn't allowed to change. So it has to just run flat or maybe deviate around it. Now, that's not really realistic in terms of psychology. I mean, people don't respond every 4 hours on the minute. Absolutely not. They tend to respond quite differently. They also have, there's also, as we'll see later, there's ubiquitous missing values in EMA research. And obviously, if you're looking at psychological processes and treatment, you want to see change. You don't want to have a static process. You want to see change. So how to tackle those issues? One of the ways, which I found to be very interesting and useful, is structural equation modeling in continuous time. Now, being a psychologist, you know what structural equation modeling is, so I don't have to waste my time with that. However, in continuous time, that's a different sort of topic. This is an interesting idea. The idea is we'll have a certain latent factor, which we measure with several indicators, and say this latent factor has a continuous evolution in time. And this allows for the calculations not only of measures we've heard before, so like autoregression, they term it inertia, or diffusion, which is all about variability of latent processes in time, or cross-correlation, which is useful to look at relationships between latent processes, but also enables us to use time-independent and time-dependent predictors. That's huge. That means you can look at how individual differences impact intra-individual variability, or you can look at how a certain thing that happens in time changes a latent process. These are really useful tools. They use Bayesian estimation, which can also be very, very useful. There are also other sorts of similar approaches. One of the most interesting I found, I didn't want to go into the details here, is also regime switching models. This comes from sort of a weather and economics research. So, for example, right now we're all sort of facing a recession, all the what is being reported. So during a recession, the economic activity has a different dynamic than during a period of economic success and growth. And different rules apply. And this has been applied, for example, the citation there is for a study of pain in rheumatic disease, where you have these attacks of increasing pain and periods where the patients feel less pain. So this is an interesting approach as well, worth looking into if you're interested in the topic. So I'll give you just an illustration of how such continuous time models look. This is an example we're working on. Where we're looking at how positive and negative affect, PA and NA, affect somatic symptoms. We measure them with different indicators, see them how they evolve through time, and see their inertia, diffusion, cross-correlation, meaning how affect affects somatic symptoms, and the other way around, looking at potential causality of these processes. Also, we can look at how time-independent So this we're looking at, so this is the model, inertia, diffusion, cross-correlation, so how affect impacts somatic symptoms and the other way around. Also, the predictor variables I've been mentioning before. Missing data is an important issue in EMA. About a quarter of data gets lost because people don't respond. Not to get into the details, it's important to say that the continuous time models turn the issue on its head. They say missing data does not exist. The only thing that exists is how well or how intensely we choose to model a continuous process. An interesting thing with EMA, we can integrate wearables and ask really interesting questions. For example, in this study by Lisa Feldman-Barrett and colleagues, do people have the same physiological reactions when experiencing the same emotions? Now, this is really exciting. EMA allows us to be context aware. So what they did is in the study is people had wearable sensors and physiology sensors looking at EKG. And when they noticed that someone's ECG substantially changed, the cardiac activity substantially changed in the absence of movement, they inferred, an emotional event is happening. And then this triggered an EMA survey what are you feeling right now? What are the circumstances, with open questions and rating scales to see what they're feeling. And their research found was that people tend to experience the same physiological symptoms, the same physiological reactions in different ways, also depending on context. So the idea was there is no universal physiological reaction to a certain, or which we conceive as a specific emotion. And this is great because this context awareness allows us to look at EMA. You walk through a door from the university, poof, you get a survey, or you end up in a park and it's asking, how are you feeling? Are you enjoying the nature? You have amazing sensors, as ingestible sensors, for example, like these. So those are really exciting. Lots of research being done for all sorts of psychopathologies. This is a review from 2020. You can see it's a growing list. I've read a few super interesting papers. Binge eating and regulating negative affect really turned its head around in terms of understanding that the classical model was false. Binging is not a way to control negative affect, as was previously sort of thought. This is an EMA meta-analysis. For example, pediatric chronic abdominal pain triggers also studied this way. Also really important findings for psychopharmacology, a topic that's often the area of research for EMA. I couldn't help but cite this study looking at birds. Hearing and seeing bird life, does it affect your wellness? An EMA study looking at how people perceive birds in nature and whether that affects their emotions. What a great idea for a study. More super ideas. EMA also allows us to study, oh yeah, great, thank you. Allows us to study interaction among people. So couples, when one person in a couple is depressed, they have less emotional reactivity. And this in turn leads to poor relationships. This in turn may also again lead to more depression. And this was a really interesting study that looked at that issue. Super interesting. How depressed parents dish up food. So another interesting interaction EMA study. So parents who are depressed or are really stressed out get home, and what do they serve their kids? Really food that's not as quality, or doesn't have that quality, and is less nutritious, and also tend to force their children to eat. I'll skip some of the stuff here. Cognitive assessment can be done that way as well. Machine learning, I just want to use a minute to talk about this. So we can sort of try and predict critical events. This was one of the ideas. Thus far, these dynamic concepts that I mentioned haven't been as successful in terms of predicting like really severe, important outcomes such as suicide. However, suicide risk in general is difficult to study. Mostly we study suicidal ideation sometimes and try to use that. What's been found is that higher suicidal ideation and stability, so those folks who tend to really differ from day to day in terms of their suicidal thoughts, tend to be more at risk, and negative affect, hopelessness, and burdensomeness tend to predict increased suicidal ideation within day. Okay, so let me, postpartum depression, that's an example of an intervention that can be really interesting in terms of helping new mothers. See, I'd like to mention that postpartum depression is the most commonly diagnosed complication of childbirth. And EMA can be used as a tool to help mothers get more insight into the relation between their sleep, their activity, and their emotional well-being, and has been in this pilot study been shown to be a useful intervention. Ecological momentary intervention, so how to give an intervention just at the right time to prevent suicide, to prevent an outbreak of a psychotic episode. Great ideas, but still a lack of empirical data, and most research is still of low quality. So here there's a lot of space for research. If you'll allow me, Tom, I'll just give some resources. From the Netherlands, I found this nice little ecological momentary assessment in mental health research, a practical introductions with examples of R, really useful if you want to do some analysis and get more into that. Empath, an easy to use flexible platform for EMA, also a paper that's out or is, I think will be published, a nice sort of user-friendly, flexible framework for doing that sort of research. You want to include wearables, Wonderful. There's another sort of software package out of paper. Let's get physical. Oh yeah, right. Let's get physical. Right here. Here's the package for wearables for integrating that. Kudos to the competition. The APA also has extensive webinars on intensive longitudinal data. If you want to do analysis of EMA data, wonderful resource there. You want to write up, so you've done an EMA study, you want to report on it. This is the paper to look at, reporting, recommended reporting guidelines and current practices. You can find that, and we'll have that, the presentations uploaded as well to look at. And of course, our webpage, not to be missed. I'm sure we'll add some stuff as time goes along. And I'd like to thank my collaborators, my Lithuanian Psychological Association for supporting my contact and my work here together with the group, and my fellow collaborating students with whom I worked with in terms of EMA research. So thank you, and that's it, I guess.
Given the time constraints, David, is it okay if we save any questions for the end? Okay, great. All right. Thank you for sticking around. I'd like to take the last 15 to 20 minutes to tell you a little bit more about immersive technologies. But first and foremost, let me quickly introduce myself. So I'm Tom. I'm the head of the expertise unit Psychology, Technology and Society at Thomas More University of Applied Sciences in Belgium. Do some work at KU Leuven and Queen's University Belfast as well. And it's my honor to be the convener for the EFPA project group on eHealth also. And again, as previously said, thank you for having us here, Jonas, today. I want to share a little bit our experience with immersive technologies. And what I'll quickly do is just give you some background on the technology itself so that you can have a better grasp of what it entails and what its potential use might be. To give you some background on which different intervention techniques have been used in the past with these technologies, and that will be the majority of my talk, to just direct you towards some existing solutions that might be interesting to apply in both research and practice as well. So immersive technologies, what is that exactly? Well, I think we've heard the term before with João, and it's mainly focusing on creating a sense of presence, the idea of actually being somewhere. And when relying on VR or 360-degree video, you really aim to teleport somebody to a totally different environment. You put a VR headset on, and all of a sudden you're no longer right here, but you're somewhere on a sunny beach, or you're spending some quality time with friends and family who are on the other side of the world, or you're back to a place where you've once developed a serious trauma or whatever. The main point remaining that you really have a sense of presence, or really the idea that you're there. AR is slightly different, augmented reality. There, it's mostly adding virtual images to the real world. Might sound a bit abstract, but I'll show you some examples later on. So, for example, adding a virtual animal like a spider or a dog in this very same room. And again, you get that sense of presence, that idea like, I know it's not a real dog, or I know it's not a real spider, but it still makes me a little bit ticklish, and I'm not too much at ease right now. Now, you might think VR, that's a flashy new thing, but you should stand corrected. The very first machines developed date back to 1962. This is called the Sensorama. It was developed by Mort Heilig all by himself, not as a part of a big institution or like nowadays with Meta and Facebook and so on, not in a big corporate context, but just a guy experimenting and creating a device that allowed immersive image, stereo sound, aromas, wind and vibrations. That's more than most headsets these days tend to offer. Unfortunately, The Sensorama had its fair share of technical difficulties and was just way ahead of its time. So it never made it to the broader audience. What did was the Meta Quest, and more recently the Meta Quest 2. I think in 2020, this was really already a breakthrough device, and it still remains to be. It's relatively affordable. It actually did a very strange thing last summer. Prices went $100 up 2 years after the release. I don't know if you've heard of any technology rising in prices after its release, but the Quest is an exception. And the thing is that it makes VR for the first time affordable, high quality experiences, relatively affordable for large audiences and masses. And what we also tend to forget in this remark and in this context is that, well, you might wonder, VR, we can use it for gaming, obviously. Is it just a playful thing? No. There is actually a long-standing research tradition by psychologists. We were way ahead of the curve, and we've been doing VR research longer than we've been doing internet-based research, for the simple reason that VR solutions have been around for longer than the internet has. So that might come as a shock to you, but it was mainly used in two different contexts: exposure therapy for phobias, and also prolonged exposure and other related treatments for PTSD. Especially the latter one has been researched the most, and it was heavily financed, especially by the US military, because they had lots of veterans coming back in from remote areas. Think of Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. I mean, they've had their fair share of wars in the past. So they had a lot of veterans that they wanted to bring back to re-immerse in scenes where traumas once occurred, and then VR proved to be a very relatively easy solution. When I say relatively easy, the basic setup cost around $25,000. So it was not as affordable as headsets are these days. Now, in the meantime, we've actually seen an explosion of different researches on ways that you can use this kind of technology. For example, for distraction, for relaxation, for psychoeducation, for behavioral activation, for cognition challenging. So a wide range of different applications that all rely on the same fact, namely transforming or transporting people to different places where you can easily put them back in time and time again, or places where you have a very high level of control on the environment. For example, you can manipulate different aspects. Want to change the weather? Okay, that's just one click of a button. Want to add a potential trigger that makes people phobic or anxious or uneasy? Well, that's very relatively easy to do. That's the main advantage of these type of immersive technologies. Beyond the fact that you can transport people to different places, you can have a high level of control, and it's a high level of replicability also for research. You can put people always in exactly the same conditions and environments. So there's definitely a lot of potential there, but you might wonder that's interesting, Tom, and research, yes, but could we also already start using this? Could a clinician interested in using this type of technology just download an application, smash it on a headset, and get started? Actually, the answer these days is yes, you can. And this is a slide I use relatively frequently, and I have to update on an almost monthly basis as more and more platforms are starting to emerge. By the way, just in case you were wondering, we'll upload all these slides afterwards on the website. And for this particular slide, there are hyperlinks behind each and every picture. So you can just click through to the different websites. Some focus on relaxation, others focus more on phobia treatment. Some are very high-end solutions costing several thousands. Other ones, like Amelia, for example, work on a subscription-based service costing only like 50 or 60 euros a month. And you can get started by treating a small limited number of patients, but at least you can get started. Now, you might wonder, okay, Tom, cool, I can buy this. But, you know, I'm actually a little bit cheap. I don't want to spend that much money if possible. Buying the headset, it's already a sufficient investment. And I fully understand you, and I feel your pain. Money is always an issue. Well, fortunately, YouTube to the rescue, because 360 videos you can find increasingly online. Back like 5 or 6 years ago, all of that stuff would be rather extreme, like walking on a tightrope bridge above the Andes, 50 meters above a steep canyon or whatever. And that might have not been really suitable for therapeutic purposes, but we now see more and more content being made and also put on YouTube VR that you can use for clinical purposes as well. Don't want to pay 500 euros for a headset? Well, you can actually even buy these type of things. This is, I think, called the Bobo VR. It's just plastic. It costs 35 euros. You can just open it up, put your smartphone in there, and view 360-degree videos. You cannot walk around because you're fixed in the point where the video was taken, but it nevertheless offers quite an immersive experience for fairly little money. We ourselves, we've been investing in creating a little bit of content at Thomas More. So you can find like a glass elevator. It's perfect if you are afraid of elevators and of heights, for example. You can just combine both. Or you can do some nature relaxation, or you can do some claustrophobic stuff. And it's just all there online. You can either use it on high-end or low-end headsets. Or if you want to invest like 300 euros or so, you can buy your own 360 video camera, which nowadays is far more easy to do. You just use like any regular smartphone, you point, click, it records, and you can upload it takes like half an hour or so afterwards on a headset, and you're done. So it's very easy to create your own proprietary environments as well. You might wonder, well, okay, if I go there to record it, why can't I take my patient? Well, for obvious reasons, it might be more practical to, especially if you're looking at more generic environments, that you can repurpose it patient after patient. Or maybe a patient is very reluctant to go to a particularly challenging spot, but maybe the idea of knowing, well, I know this is not real, if I could at least see it virtually, that step is a step I might be willing to take. Then these relatively low-tech solutions are actually an interesting path or possibility to explore. Yeah, we had some problems running the video on this computer, so I just have some stills, but this is basically like us just shooting some pictures at a lake. You can add some text there with some instructions, and then you can have people looking around. So now, yeah, it was a recording of people looking around. Now it's just stills. But that definitely has some possibilities. But obviously that's just you creating content then in terms of evidence base and effectiveness. I mean, this is much more like hands and crafts work, basic stuff. Fortunately, there's also different things like xerophobia. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with xerophobia. There's xerophobia, fear of heights, and there's also now xerophobia, fear of flying, where you can just put that app on your smartphone. It costs like, I think, 8 euros or something like that. It is proven to be effective. It's split screen, but if you use that kind of a cheap headset, it feels immersive and you have a sense of depth. You can choose different challenges. You cannot physically, again, walk around, but you have a sense of movement going up staircases. And as it's been developed in the Netherlands, you have a nice scenic overview of the city of Amsterdam, for example. But it's shown as a, well, self-help intervention to work to reduce fear of heights effectively. Taking into consideration what Jonas said earlier, though, it's best if, for example, a therapist guides you and you use this as an add-on to your therapy. Another fun app, and one that we've been researching ourselves extensively, is Phobos AR. Phobos AR allows you to take all animals that you rather not have in your house or in your room, or perhaps too close by, like Dobermans, rats, cockroaches, spiders, snakes, and so on, and add them in an environment using augmented reality. For those of you physically here, I can show you later on, perhaps in the corridor, how that kind of looks like. And we've done some studies with that and found that it actually triggers real life fear responses from people, for example, afraid of dogs and spiders and whatnot. Oh yeah, and this is going to glitch. Oh, I didn't know I had a video in there. but I'll show it later outside. That might work better. Another one that builds on the same rationale as Phobos AR, but actually also has psychoeducation embedded within the app is Phobis. It's a German application only for spider phobia, but again, using that same approach. So it's a bit of a crossover between Zero Phobia and Phobos AR. A very interesting app, proven effective in a controlled study. And again, you can purchase it in the App Store for a couple of euros. I wouldn't just recommend it to people to use as self-help, again, for the obvious reasons that they probably won't make the most out of it, but it might be a nice addition above and beyond the conventional therapy. And as I only had very little time for you guys today, and I need to rush through things a little bit, I think that was my main quick overview for now. I think the my main message at this point would be that we've come at a very exciting point in time with these immersive technologies. They're increasingly cheap, increasingly easy to make. There's some very nice initiatives just around the corner that will probably allow clinicians also to recreate relatively easily custom environments, for example, from Google Maps footage and whatnot. And but for now, if you want to explore this, and I should have perhaps included that one as well, I would definitely recommend exploring relaxation techniques using virtual reality. There's an application, for example, called Flowborn. You can also find it for iOS and Android, just as basic apps, non-immersive apps, that you can use to do guided breathing exercises. And it really, because it's immersive, you can really shut off a patient from the real world, give him 5 to 10 minutes to really come, well, to rest, to really go a bit at ease. And it might be helpful, especially for people who have difficulties to disconnect from daily life, because you physically move them to a different place and potentially also time. So definitely explore it. There's not much wrong to be done with that, unless you're starting to do trauma treatment stuff just out of the blue, but especially relaxation aspects and so on are definitely interesting. Try YouTube VR. You can actually do that on a regular computer as well. The only difference then is that you need to scroll around using your mouse to look inside the environments, but you can easily preview them without having a headset. And like for, I think Google Cardboard costs 10 euros. The slightly more expensive plastic headsets cost around 20 to 30, 35 euros. And I think the Bobo VR, we've tested it in research and still have to publish it, is at the moment the best value for money kind of thing also for clinicians. So if you're interested in that, definitely look into that. And if there are any questions, don't hesitate to ask in time. So, and with that, I think I'm now really going to conclude. So thank you for your attention. Maybe one last word, Jonas?
Yeah. Any questions?
Oh, yes, questions.
Yeah. Can you use the mic so that people online could hear you as well?
Maybe you know, or you're aware of, is there any like safety guidelines for virtual reality? Because for example, I could think of some risks, you know, and but would be my personal opinion, but maybe there is some science-backed guidelines how to use it safely. And especially when you mentioned trauma cases, and sometimes trauma is, you know, unconscious.
Well, so there are actually two sets of guidelines. One is relates to COVID, because that was apparently all of a sudden a fairly challenging thing, because you put stuff on people's heads and noses. Yeah, you don't want to be transferring that type of illness. So there's a lot of guidelines regarding the safety of the physical environment surrounding you. You don't want to do this in big open spaces, but with a huge gap somewhere in the floor, because people will be walking around in VR not seeing any obstacles or risks in real life. That's one thing. The other thing is that if you approach these type of virtual environments as if they were physical environments over which you just have a little bit more control, then there's not much that you can do wrong. So if you shouldn't use VR to treat trauma if you're not familiar or skilled to treat trauma in real life as well. But if you approach it, and if you definitely do not underestimate its potential impact that it can have on people, and if you say, well, we're going to bring you back to the virtual trauma place, and you approach that as if it is the actual trauma place, and you take all the necessary precautions building up to that, doing it imaginary in advance and so on, then there's not that much that you can do wrong per se. So it's not that it's fundamentally different. And I think that actually applies to all of the technologies that we've discussed today and the other ones that are around as well. Technology is not fundamentally different of a technological conventional working. It just extends the possibilities that we have, and we should probably just treat it as such as well, as meaningful new tools that we can use just as we would paper and pen questionnaires or any physical aids that we have in the real life environment. I hope that kind of answers your question a little bit.
Wonderful. So I think we'll need to wrap it up now.
Yes.
And I want to thank everyone who was attending, and also speakers for sharing their knowledge. It was a sneak peek. We did say it's going to be a sneak peek, so expect more extensive